This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Polity, Caitlin N., Jan H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G., and V! I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and this week, since we've just recently had Valentine's Day, I wanted to talk a little bit about the dark feminine as it connects to love, and in particular to certain love goddesses. Now, the love goddesses I'm going to be covering in this episode are Aphrodite, Ishtar, Freya, and Rati. And they are coming from, respectively, Aphrodite is Greek. Of course, she's associated also with the goddess Venus in the Roman. We have Ishtar, who is a Mesopotamian goddess, so Babylonian, Sumerian. You see the mythology of Ishtar, or Inanna, as she is sometimes called, in that particular culture. Then we have Freya, who is a goddess in the Norse, particularly I think in the Scandinavian. We see that, and she's sometimes also associated with the goddess Frigg. And then we have Rati, who is literally a goddess. She's really a minor goddess, but she is associated with desire, with sexual desire, and she is the partner, the wife of Kama, who is Kamadeva, who is the god of desire and love. Like he's a little bit like the how do you want to put it? The Hindu version of Cupid or Eros, in that he has his little bow and arrow and he shoots it at people to make them fall in love, or to at least to have desire. So we're going to be looking at those figures. Now, I should stress up front that this is not going to be a podcast that is just going to be about those. It's not going to be a podcast on those four figures specifically. It's only going to cover certain stories and certain aspects of a broader picture that I want to look at. And the broader picture that I want to look at has to do with love, in the sense, like, what do we mean by the term love? Like, when we talk about a love goddess, what is a love goddess? What does that mean? So, and how is that terminology understood by us? Because love doesn't always mean the same thing, right? Like, the love that you might have for your mom is not going to be the same as the kind of love somebody would have for their partner. You know what I mean? Like their lover. It's not the same. Well, we hope it's not. It's not the same kind of a thing. Or the love that you might have for a good friend whom you care about. You know, or a love one might have of mankind, humankind is the right term, not mankind. It's that, it's this idea that, we have this, there's this differing ideas about love and what it is. So I want to talk a little bit about that first, and then I want to talk a little bit about the dark feminine and what, that's also a term that people have a little bit of a hard time with, a little phrase that people have a hard time with. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by that and where that connects into ideas about love. And maybe a little bit about also what we mean by ideas of the Chtonic when we think of love, okay? Because Chtonic is also not a term that everybody understands. Sure, many people who listen to this podcast regularly do understand what the term means, but it's not a very common term to hear outside of certain, say, academic disciplines or certain other contexts that people have. People who study mythology, maybe even in role-playing games, you might know the term, but it's not a term that everybody necessarily just knows. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things a little bit more broadly, and I want to bring those goddesses in as examples of what I'm talking about. So first, when we talk about the idea of love, like everything that we seem to get in Western culture, I think our ideas about love tend to come from Greek philosophy. particularly Plato, Plato's Symposium, where he talks a lot about love and the nature of love. And then we have ideas that are carried over into what we think of now as monotheistic or Abrahamic religions. And we say Abrahamic because that is the one thing that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have in common, is this sort of ancestral figure of Abraham and the connections to that tie it to whatever the later stories are. So yeah, all of those religions tend to have a particular idea of love. And then there's a particular idea of love that we also have just with respect to society, societal role, and also the different aspects of the feminine, okay? The different ways that we characterize women in connection to the idea of love. Because we talk about these different ideas. For example, when we talk about the soul, the anima, certain aspects of the soul are what they call the virgin whore kind of thing. And we refer to it kind of as an axis, right? Like these are two poles. The woman who is considered to be the whore is the one who is more sexually available and carnal and licentious and, may have multiple partners. Whereas you have the virgin on the other end of the spectrum who is innocent and pure and not sexual at all. But, that has to do with love in the sense of coming together. And again, when this was talked about certainly as male-female love, but it does not have to just be male-female love. You do see examples also from Greek mythology of female-female love, male-male love, and there is even discussions of gender fluidity and what they might have called dual-sexed or hermaphroditic type of sex or sexuality. So that is not also alien to ancient mythologies as well. Though a lot of times it seems to be talked about in strictly male-female terms. Again, there's exceptions. I'm probably going to stick to that definition just for the sake of this podcast, because I feel like getting into actually what might be an interesting subject to talk about at some point, to see where gender fluidity and this idea of same-sex relationships and other where that fits in to the mythology. I think that would be an interesting topic to discuss. But for the point of just keeping things on task with the examples we have here, that's what I'm going to be sticking to, what we think of as male-female heterosexual relationships when we talk about it in this context. But I want to make it clear that I don't think that those are the only definitions. I just feel like the other sort of deserves its own discussion, really, just to bring it in. So to see where that would fit in. So, okay. So, yeah. So when I say the Platonic idea of love, Plato makes this distinction between what we will think of as sexual love and desire, things that are a little bit more carnal in nature, as opposed to what he would call this Platonic love. And Platonic, when we talk about a Platonic relationship with somebody, it's the idea that you love somebody not only perhaps are you physically attracted, but that you are also attracted to their mind. And it really is more of a Platonic relationship. When we use that expression now, it's generally a relationship between two people, usually of the opposite sex, who have a great regard for each other and maybe even a deep caring for each other, but it doesn't translate into a sexual relationship because it's cerebral. It's about how you are attracted to how you're attracted to somebody's mind. Really is often the way that is. Or it's just you share an affinity for each other, but you don't share a carnal desire. That's usually what a Platonic relationship is defined as. Because what's happening here is you have this act of separation of body and mind. Okay, you have this idea that attraction, lust, carnal relationships are something separate from relationships that should be purely cerebral, and we tend to place a higher value on the second one rather than the first. The first type, why don't we distinguish them just for argument's sake between lust and love? Because lust is what we tend to think of has to do more with physical attraction. When we fall in love with somebody for the first time, it generally starts with a physical attraction. You see somebody and you go, ooh, who's that, right? Or somebody looks at you that way or whatever. There's something there that happens. And yes, there's now people trying to define it in terms of the chemical reactions that go on and so forth. We all know there's a chemistry factor, okay? There's something, but from a Jungian perspective, it would be happening. This is about soul projections. So for whatever reason, the thing that invokes those chemical reactions is the fact that you have spotted somebody who in some way matches your soul image, whatever that is, whether it's a masculine image or a feminine image. Again, anima is usually the female soul within a man, and the animus being the male soul within the female. Again, strictly speaking in these terms, I often expand the definition to say, if you are somebody who is attracted to men, then you are probably somebody who has an animus, because you have this male image that's being projected on to the males that you are attracted to. If you are mainly attracted to women, regardless of your biological sex, then you are probably have an anima. And some people say, hey, well, what about people who like both? And it's like, well, then there's probably, you could argue that there's elements of both that could occur. I mean, I don't know, there's been more recent Jungian theory on people having both an anima and animus. But I think one would tend to, I would suggest in that kind of a case, where does your attention trend to more often? Which sex, or person who has appearance of certain sex? What do you trend to more often? That would at least be my thing. Now, I'm not necessarily supported in Jungian theory by this, but nonetheless, there is a projection of the soul image onto another person. That soul image behaves in a certain way, and the aspects of the way that soul image behaves tends to dictate how we view the relationship, whether we view it merely as a fantasy lover, carnal kind of, where it's strictly about, I see that person, I'm aroused, I want to go to bed with them, versus wanting to have something that is a more serious relationship, wanting a situation that is more on factors other than physical desire or physical attraction. And oftentimes, ideally, in a love relationship, you're going to have an element of both. Because your partner is generally somebody who's they're at least going to be attractive to you, right? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, they say. So even if your partner doesn't look like somebody who meets some kind of societal definition of being gorgeous or whatever, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is, when you see that person's beautiful to you. The aesthetic element is there. But then the question becomes, is this something where you're looking to build a relationship or not? I mean, again, I think ideally people are hoping that you're going to have both elements within a relationship. Doesn't always happen that way, or it's very complicated for it to happen that way. Oftentimes, love will start with an attraction to somebody that is physical and maybe more carnal. But as the question is, will that relationship develop into something else? I've talked before many times about the Eros and Psyche myth, or Cupid and Psyche myth, and interestingly, Psyche is a name that stands for soul, and so we have this soul image that goes back and forth. And when Cupid initially falls in love with Psyche, it is a physical attraction. He's physically attracted to her. And when he carries her off, though, she doesn't actually get to see him. So we're not talking about, like Jung would refer to this as a conscious versus unconscious relationship. You don't actually know who the person is. This person is more like a fantasy. So when Eros makes love to her, he comes to her at night. He's invisible. There's not allowed to see him. There's no lights on. And everybody around her is invisible. She's just in this beautiful palace where she has whatever she wants. Okay. She's, it's not that she's mistreated or anything, but she's alone. She's basically alone, kind of trapped in this unconscious space, which we would call the belly of the whale, right? They're trapped in this space, and eventually, when she approaches Eros with a knife in her hand, after her sisters tell her, hey, you're supposed to be married to a monster here, maybe you need to do something about that. So she takes the lamp and she takes the knife, and then she sees her husband's the god of love, and she goes, ooh. But now, see, she doesn't need the knife because she's got the light. That's what provides that. I'm going to use the word discrimination, and when I use the word, I don't mean discrimination in the negative sense, in the way I'm going to discriminate against you. I mean more in the sense of discrimination in the sense of being able to differentiate between things, like having enough to be able to see something clearly and make a judgment about it based on seeing it clearly. Okay, that's what they call the discrimination. And so she now can see him, and now she can make a conscious choice about how he feels, but then of course he wakes up, he feels betrayed, and he takes off. And thus her tasks begin and her suffering begins. Okay? Now, this is probably a good place to kind of slide into a discussion about Aphrodite, because Aphrodite absolutely hates Psyche. Now think about this. The goddess of love hates a girl who is connected, whose image is connected to the anima or to the soul. Love hates the soul. Okay, let's think about that for a minute. So Aphrodite, because remember, initially Psyche goes and appeals to, she appeals to Hera, she appeals to Athena, asking for help in her situation now that Eros has left. Now Athena is a virgin goddess, okay, and she definitely has a bearing. Now she's connected to war, okay, but she has a bearing. She's definitely. She's not interested in love and romance. Athena is removed from that. I mean, she does deal with the day-to-day domestic things. She's weaving and, certain tasks that were associated with femininity. She is a goddess associated with justice, but she's not, and she is a strategist in war. But she's born out of her father's forehead, which is hugely symbolic in and of itself. Okay, she's a goddess of wisdom because presumably Zeus, she jumps out of the forehead of Zeus because Zeus has swallowed her presumed mother, who is Metis, the goddess of wisdom, the Titaness of wisdom. And when Zeus gets Metis pregnant and then finds out that Metis is going to give birth to a child who is going to basically succeed him or overthrow him, then he swallows her. And then then Metis, it's Zeus who really gives birth to Athena instead of Metis. And it's he has a headache, and, the normal manner that we all handle headaches, he asks the god Hephaestus to slam him in the head with a sledgehammer, right? and his head splits open, and Athena comes springing full grown from his forehead. So anyway, I don't want to digress into Athena, but the point being is that she is definitely coming. She's not a goddess of carnal desire, okay? She's not a goddess that has to do with carnal desire, and not necessarily even with having a husband or partner. And because she is not interested in bearing children or having a partner, Athena, therefore, is just like, she doesn't engage in that, because obviously there's this idea about civilized marriage, which is where you turn to Hera, because Hera is a goddess of civilized marriage. And it's interesting that the Greek ideal about civilized marriage is a man who's philandering all the time and a woman who is constantly getting revenge on those who he has been philandering with. So, because it's almost like Hera as a goddess of civilized marriage has something against the seductive female. Okay, she's got something against the seductive female, because it's almost like the idea of when you're in a marriage relationship. Remember I said, well, I don't remember if I said this or not, but maybe in my own mind I did. But basically, when you talked about the idea of a marriage, frequently it was an arranged marriage between people based on position or how much money or dowry or something that they brought, what they brought to the table. Now, attractiveness definitely was part of the equation. I mean, if you think about the fact that the Trojan War started over Helen of Sparta, and she's Helen of Sparta because she's married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. She's later referred to as Helen of Troy when she's stolen away by Paris, when Aphrodite, again, grants him and says, she says, I'll give, there's that whole golden apple episode that the Aricians will all know about, and so a golden apple is thrown in at the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, who are the parents of Achilles later. And the goddess Eris, goddess of chaos, is not invited. So Eris is put out by this. So Eris throws this golden apple in amongst Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And it says, to the fairest. And the three women argue about who is entitled to have, who is the fairest of the three of them. Okay, and this is a great argument to put, among women. Great way to challenge the animus energy there. Even though you can argue gods are not subject to that, but that's certainly, if you're taking an inflection from Greek myth on human psychology, that's certainly one of them. So they call in Paris, the son of the prince, he's Prince of Troy, to come in and to mediate between them. He comes in now. You have to almost feel sorry for Paris here, almost, because he's a bit between a rock and a hard place. Like there's no way, whatever decision he makes, he's going to somehow suffer for, because when you have three powerful goddesses and you have to decide which one's the fairest. So this, of course, decision takes place the way you might imagine, through bribery. So Hera says to him that she'll make him a king and make him a great leader, of cities. She has Athena, who will make him a great warrior. And Aphrodite says, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world as your wife. Now, Paris being a bit of a romantic here. He's definitely not on the hardened warrior side. Guess you could read that a couple ways, right? But he's not one of the guys, these, certainly the warriors chose their women based on how attractive they found them, especially if they were eluding a place, and women, of course, were regarded as loot. So he was basically allowed to go in. Menelaus kind of conveniently went away, and Paris came in as a guest. But see, Paris takes Helen away and he violates the rules of Xenia. He's come into the house of somebody welcomed as a guest, and then he steals something from the household. He steals the woman of the house, basically. And so they talk about that as the abduction of Helen. And the thing is, there's a whole league of men who wanted to marry Helen because she was so beautiful. And they have all sworn an oath to Menelaus when he gets chosen as her husband. Okay, and not clear to me whether she made the choice, or whether the choice was made for her. But the impression you get is that she was able to choose from the suitors the man she wanted. Okay? And so the others swore an oath that if anybody tried to take Helen from Menelaus, that they would all rally behind him. Like they would go to war on his behalf to get the woman back. Which is why some people, in some versions of the epic cycle, there's a story that Zeus and Thetis weirdly conspire to bring about a second end to humanity. But the first one has to do with the flood. Because yes, there is a flood myth in Greek mythology too. The idea that this was a way, because this arrangement was there, it was going to bring this whole league of what they call the Achaean League. It wasn't really called Greece back then. So you have all these various tribal kingdoms. That's why you have this catalog of ships, boring catalog of ships in like book 2 of the Iliad, where they go on and they say, and this one came, and he was the king of this, and he brought this many ships and this many men. Like this is this long, long thing that I'm sure most of my mythology and Troy students skip over when they have to read it. But the idea was that you had this league, and you had certain individuals who served as generals, like Agamemnon, who was from Mycenae, and Achilles, who is Myrmidon, and then you have Diomedes, who comes from Argos. You have all these really great leaders who are coming from these things, and they come to fight and it's a war over a woman. And so here's our first instance of looking at how Aphrodite, the goddess of love, connects to war. You basically have men going to war over the most beautiful woman in the world. But Helen, in this case, you have to remember that she is, for all intents and purposes, she's loot. Now we get into the subject of objectification versus, it's basically, are you treating a person as an object or as a subject? The thing that is often said about, and I think this was more of the philosophical definition, is that when you want to be involved with somebody for very strictly physical reasons, you think they're hot, basically. If it's strictly about that, then this is really treating a person as an object. If you get to know somebody and you don't really care you don't care anything about their personality or what they do, or you might you've seen cases, you hear about this a lot, where whether it be the man doing it or the woman, a lot of times you do hear about it with the man doing this to the woman, pretending to be interested in what they're interested in because they just want to get into bed, right? And so, yeah, it's the idea of treating a woman as an object because you're only looking at the physical fantasy. It is a total anima projection, and it is totally unconscious because you don't know anything about that person. Okay, that person is just an object. And that's why sometimes with things like that, you can enter into a carnal relationship with somebody and it might go on. It might turn into an obsession. It might turn into possessiveness. It might turn into, or the person might, the anima projection might be withdrawn. They might get bored with the person and walk away and act like they never knew them after that. And these things all happen, right? When we're talking about carnal desire. So I think also from that philosophical point of view, this is the reason that Plato and his ilk would have said that this is an inferior kind of love. Now, once you start getting into talking about taking what we think of as modern religion, which is not the same as ancient religion in its inflection, because modern religion talks about the idea of a personal God who's personally involved in you, your life, and what you're doing, and is making some kind of a good, bad judgment about things. That there are things that are there are definite rules, there's a definite book that tells you what the rules are, and that certain things are good and certain things are bad. And we have come through those mythologies to have our ideas about what's good and what's evil. So, and as I have mentioned, as my entire book is about, is the idea that when you start moving categories in that direction, I mean, and not just because of this, but that's when you're now getting into a space where that which is associated with the earth, with the Chtonic, okay? Chtonios is a word that means earth or what lies under the earth. When that which lies under the earth, and that thing's associated with it, so anything having to do with agriculture, fertility, things that grow. So yes, it might have to do with childbirth, but not necessarily. It has to do with sexuality, lovemaking, all of these things that have to do with the carnal aspect of coming together. Rati, who is the consort of Kama, as I mentioned in the Hindu, Rati is said to have been born from the sweat of Daksha, who is the progenitor. And it's certainly believed in Vedic Hinduism that the kind of bodily fluids that are discharged during sex are considered to be a pollution. So now we're getting into tantric territory again, but that your body fluids are somehow whereas others would look at them as being kind of a source of power, and the orgasm as being a source of power or an expression of that drive or that energy, sexual energy being associated with this kind of consciousness. This was often regarded that aspect of it was the pollution that came off of it, because anything that comes out of that part of the body, whether it be having to do with sex or excretion or anything else, we tend to look at as dirty, viewed as an impurity, as a pollution. So that is literally what Rati's name means. She's born out of that, and she is literally about carnal desire. She has nothing to do with motherhood. Even though she has a spouse, is Kama, Lord Kama, and who she is devoted to, she is not. She is a representation of pure carnal desire. And in the image of Chinnamasta, who is one of the Mahavidyas, I do have a podcast on Chinnamasta, if anybody is interested in knowing more about her and doesn't know about her. But she has one of the most shocking, it's one of the most shocking images that you see in Hinduism of a goddess, because you are showing a woman who has decapitated her own head, with blood pouring out, shooting out two sides. There's two women on either side of her, two Dakinis standing on either side of her, with their mouths open, drinking the blood. And she's actually also, one of the streams is going into the mouth of her own severed head. And she's standing kind of on one foot. She's got this garland of skulls, and she's standing in this position on top of Rati and Kama, who are copulating underneath her feet. So it's a really powerful image about the connection between sex, sexuality, and that power, that power of the soul, that power of consciousness that comes in there. Now, one of the interesting things about Rati, since we're talking about her, is the fact that she carries a sword. Okay? Now, that's an interesting weapon. If we consider, as I mentioned earlier about discrimination, the sword is the symbol of discrimination. There's a Buddhist deity called the Manjushri who carries the sword of discrimination. And the idea is, and when you see deities like Kali carrying a sword, or Durga, other goddesses who are associated with destruction, when they carry a sword, the idea is, well, the sword can actually do a couple of things. The sword, it's seen as a mode of discrimination. So it's something that represents clarity. Like, okay, if you read tarot, the Ace of Swords is a card about something that comes in and it just absolutely cuts to. It's something that shows you the truth of a situation. So swords are associated with truth, and they're often with intellectual truth. So why is a goddess of carnal desire, and she's literally the embodiment of carnal desire? I mean, that's literally what she is. She's not sitting there doing philosophical thinking. She is a goddess connected to carnal desire, and she's devoted to her partner. And so why is she carrying a sword? Well, I mean, yes, we can consider that Kama is carrying bow and arrows, like Cupid. Has a weapon of his own. But why would his wives be a sword? Now, some people might note the phallic nature of a sword. But again, this is the female goddess who's carrying the sword. It's not like you have a male representation showing this aspect. And really, what I think the sword represents here, among other things, this is the idea of the sword as that which separates. Okay, because it's interesting, because even though sex is an act that brings people together, if a child is the result of sex, it represents this idea there's this idea of separation contained within coming together. There's this. Okay, so if we go back to Plato's idea about love and why men and women are attracted to each other, his theory, and again, this is purely mythological, but he talks about Aphrodite and the god Hermes or Hermaeus, that they have a child together, and their child is called Hermaphroditus. Now, basically, Hermes and Aphrodite, the same, one name. So Hermaphroditus is the story of him is that he's a very beautiful young man who is then seen by a nymph. I don't have Ovid in front of me. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. But in any case, this nymph is madly, like crazy for him. And so she basically approaches him and she throws herself at him and he's like, whoa, like he's kind of backs off, like, leave me alone, and he tries to run away from her. And she's so upset at him running away that she chases after him and she prays that she's going to get him and she's not going to be separated from him. So this wish that she makes, this magical wish, is granted, and the two bodies fuse together. So Hermaphroditus is actually himself plus this nymph, and so it's basically a male-female figure who also has both sets of sexual organs. And yeah, so this is the idea of a dual-sexed being. Now, what Plato's idea came from is that he says that originally all humans were dual-sexed. Originally, men and women were one unit, that they were not separate. But that interestingly, Zeus decided that these mortals that to have a dual-sexed being, a hermaphrodite, that these beings were too powerful and could probably overthrow the gods. So they took the sword, they separated the two of them. And that now men and women continually try to connect with each other because they're trying to reconnect their two missing halves. This is the mythology of the hermaphrodite that you see in Plato's Symposium. So this is an interesting idea, and so we have this almost idea of the way in which the act of bringing together also represents a kind of separateness. So if you think about the sword as having this power of separation, that's one possible interpretation you could have. Another possible interpretation, though, again, if you think of the sword as an instrument of destruction, the carnal act is one that can bring about creation. It is also one that can potentially bring about destruction. Okay? So interesting symbolism there, because again, Rati is not one of those that you see going to war, say, against the other deities. She is probably a Shakti of a sort, but she literally represents desire. Although all of the yoginis and dakinis and the matrikas and all of the beings that surround the central goddess of desire, Lalita Tripura Sundari, who's represented by the Sri Yantra, and I've got podcasts on that as well. Yeah, they all are manifestations of desire. In fact, when Rati's spouse, Kama, is destroyed by Shiva, and he's destroyed by Shiva, Shiva's wife Shakti, there's the whole story of her immolating herself when her husband is insulted by her father, and I'm not going to repeat that whole story, but when Shiva finds out that his wife is dead, he rushes down, and in his more of his Rudrik form, which is more he's the Bhairava form. He comes down in his form and he basically ruins her father's sacrifice. He's making the great yanya, the great sacrifice that kind of keeps things going. And Shiva comes in and destroys it, and she kills everybody, including her father, for doing this. But then he's appealed to, because it's like, well, no, you can't do this because you're going to destroy everything if you do this. And Shiva, who's very, very flexible, he can get really enraged and start destroying things. And then 2 minutes later, someone throws himself on his mercy, and he's like, all right. He'll kind of switch around. So he brings him back to life, although I think he gives him like an ass's head. It's another that's another theme that could be talked about in mythology. Having your head replaced with either a donkey's head or ass's ears or something like that. And eventually her father becomes a devotee of Shiva, but Shakti is dead. So Shiva goes off to the woods by himself, and then Shakti is reborn as goddess Parvati, the daughter of the Himalayas. And Shiva and Shakti, Shiva and Parvati have to remarry and bear this one child, because this child there's an Ashuric force or a demonic force taking over, and it's like, okay, we need a child here to take care of this, so we need the two of them to have this child, and for them to reunite. But the thing is, Shiva isn't looking at any woman. He's so completely engaged in meditation. He's in the woods, and so they send Kama to shoot Shiva, like to bring Parvati in front of him, and Parvati's already in love with him, but to shoot him with an arrow so that when he opens his eye and looks on Parvati, he will have desire for her. And they do this, and it works, but Shiva looks around and he is like, where did this come from? Because he's somebody who has tamed his desire through his meditation, right? And when he sees Kama, he opens his third eye and he just incinerates him to ashes. So this idea of destroying the desire in this way, in the same way that Mother Kali, by wearing all these severed heads, represents the way in which the ego intellect is also cut off. The way in which you are talking about realities that are beyond all of this. So, of course, now Rati, of course, is distressed because her husband is now dead. But ultimately, now there's different stories about how he reincarnates and so forth. But one thing that was also discussed in certain versions of this story is that Lalita Tripura Sundari resurrects desire and brings him back into the world, because desire is an important function of the world. Okay, you do not want to live in a world without desire, without ecstasy, without eroticism. You don't want to live in a world without that. And so question is, why do people not want that? Why do people say, no, I'm not interested in any of that. I don't want any of that. Well, yeah, there is the whole notion of being freed from desire, right? Because we want to feel like we can go around and our movements and our energy are not drained by emotions, by feelings about things. And there's certain times when that is entirely appropriate. But to not engage with love in this sense is to really separate yourself from life. It's to separate yourself from nature, from this gift that we have naturally, if you want to think about it as a biological chemical thing. When you think about intercourse and what's involved in arousal and things like that, it's part of that aspect of life that has a beauty to it. The thing is, it also has a suffering to it. When people fall in love, okay, so what happens? When you desire the other person, we frequently will say, and again, it can vary. I don't want to say only women do this or only men do this or whatever, because it totally varies based on the situation. But you might have one partner or the other who wants to possess the other person, or the one that wants to have situations where men still view women as property, or the fact that women may be treated that way. One good example of that we see in the modern world is the woman who, if she goes out and she feels like she's being harassed by men or a group of men who may be making comments or maybe something, and maybe she feels like she's going to be, if she rejects them, that she could be assaulted. One of the things that they feel like she has to do is to say, oh, well, I have a boyfriend, or to produce a guy who pretends to be a boyfriend if she doesn't have one. And we all say, well, that's ridiculous. A woman should not have to do that. But that comes from this kind of, leftover script that you see of women as property. Okay. Who are you the property of? Oh, you're not the property of somebody? Well, then somehow you're fair game because you're not property. And then sometimes the people who engage in that kind of behavior don't see what's wrong with it, because it's like, well, because the woman is not an object. Now, interestingly, the kind of reverse of this, I call it the reverse Medusa kind of thing, because Medusa is a goddess that talks about this. When she looks at men, she turns them to stone. You have this idea of this force that makes people into objects. And there's different stories about Medusa and her connection to Poseidon, or whether she was born a Gorgon, or whatever. And I've done separate podcasts on Medusa and the Gorgons, so I'm not going to get into that subject here. But there is a situation that I almost call reverse Medusa, and that is another Aphrodite story, and that is the story of what we say Pygmalion and Galate. Now, by the way, we don't know that this figure's name is Pygmalion. This was a name that was given later, I think, I don't know if it was Shakespeare who did it. It was one of the playwrights named this character Pygmalion. And I can't remember, but I know it comes out of the literature of that time period. And the original story, I don't think, mentions the man's name. It just says that he is someone who lives on the island of Cyprus, which is the island that is sacred to Aphrodite, because that's where she was said to have born. She's foam-born, and she's born when Uranus, the sky god, is castrated, and his genitals fall into the ocean. Among the other things, like certain giants and monsters and things, out of the foam that rises, Aphrodite floats to the shore on a conch shell. In fact, one of my students that I'd had told me at one point that he actually had lived in Cyprus, and he actually lived right near the site where mythologically this was supposed to have occurred. So this story is one where there's a sculptor who we'll call Pygmalion just to give him a name. He is, a lot of the women who live on the island are of that more licentious, sexually promiscuous kind of way. They're very carnal. He is somebody who is not that way. He is somebody who is more intellectual, or at least he's somebody that, for him, he's just not out looking to satisfy his urges and then go home. Like he wants a woman whom he can really love. So he is not attracted to the women that he sees. So he's a sculptor, and he lives alone. And he makes a statue for himself of a woman. And he looks at this statue, and he starts to fall in love with the statue. He starts doing weird things, like bringing home flowers and trinkets and things for the statue. But it's a statue, okay? Some of you are going, oh boy, that's talk about your fetish object here. But he starts to fall in love with this statue, but the statue is just an object. So what he does is there's the annual festival of Aphrodite. He goes to the festival, he makes his offering to Aphrodite and prays to her. He says, look, I know this is asking a lot, but I'm really in love with this statue, and if you could make her into a real woman, that would be like super cool. Well, he doesn't quite say it that way, but he prays to Aphrodite to make his statue real. And she's actually moved by this because his desire just seems to be so very genuine. So he's at the festival, he goes home, and when he goes home, his statue is no longer there, and instead there's a living woman, sitting there smiling at him. It's his statue come to life. So Aphrodite granted his wish and brought his statue to life. And so the two of them, Pygmalion, and he calls her Galate, and so she becomes his wife. So this is an example of an object that becomes a subject. She's not just something that he stares at and worships, she becomes a real being. And that love can turn somebody into a real being, and it can also turn them into an object. One of the stories about Medusa is that Athena, as we know is this virgin goddess, punishes her for having sex with Poseidon. Okay, and it's not clear whether Poseidon has assaulted her. In some versions, that's what's happened. In others, she sort of openly defies Athena, even though she's supposed to be a priestess of Athena, and so Athena's punishing her. So different inflections in different versions of the story. This idea of, because probably, from Athena's point of view, she's viewing carnality as this kind of objectification, so she turns Medusa into a figure that whoever she looks at, they turn to stone. Just as we have the Dionysus with the gift of King Midas, turning everyone and everything that he touches into gold, which was something he requested, and then realized, maybe I didn't want that. But anyway, I'd probably be talking about that in a separate thing. All right, so we're seeing this connection here between love and war. We also have Ishtar, and goddess Ishtar is She's the queen of heaven, of course, or sometimes called Inanna. And, there are famous stories associated with her. The two main ones that we have, one is associated with Gilgamesh. Her lover is an agricultural god called Tammuz. But what she does, I'm just going to read this actually from my own book, Death and the Maiden. I said, Ishtar is a Mesopotamian goddess of love and fertility, but also of war, combat, and political power. She's related to Sumerian goddess Inanna and the Semitic goddess Astarte or Asherah, originally a consort of the Hebrew Yahweh. She's seductive yet deadly goddess, which makes her a quintessential anima figure. In the Gilgamesh epic, she attempts to seduce Gilgamesh when he returns from his successful exploit against Humbaba, who is a deity of the forest. But Gilgamesh does not fall for her charms, and this is what he says to her when she tries to seduce him. What lover of thine is there whom thou dost love forever? What shepherd of thine is there who can please thee for all time? Come, and I will unfold thee the tale of thy lovers. For Tammuz, thy youthful husband, thou hast decreed wailing year after year. And so what this, the interpretation here, Tammuz is an ancient vegetation god, just as Adonis is in another myth connected to Aphrodite. He dies from the heat of Ishtar's passion, that is, the summer heat, and is mourned as part of a Babylonian ritual. Gilgamesh points out that all's Ishtar's stinking deeds and rotten acts. She responds in rage by sending the bull of heaven to destroy him, but Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu kill the bull and sacrifice it to the sun god Shamash. Now, I mentioned this scholar, Rivka Scharf-Kluger. She says that the bull of heaven is actually a negative feminine manifestation. Ishtar's rage at being insulted for having her rotten deeds pointed out. There's a similar motif in Mithraism in the image of the Tauroctony, in which Mithras, who represents the sun here, slays the bull, which represents the moon. And the aggressive force of the bull suggests that the unconscious rage has now been made conscious. And she also compares this to Odysseus' counter with Circe or Kirke, which I did already talk about. So what happens, okay, if we just take a step back and look at that, she wants to seduce Gilgamesh, and she offers him things. And he basically says to her, look, anybody who has gotten involved with you meets a really bad end. Now, there's another story connected to Tammuz, and this is when Ishtar as Inanna, this is more in the, there's actually a poem called the Descent of Inanna, which is from roughly, I think they said between 1900 and 1600 BCE, so it's quite old. She goes down to the underworld to attend basically the funeral of her brother-in-law, because Ereshkigal, her sister, her husband has died, and so Inanna goes to basically attend the funeral, but Ereshkigal doesn't want her down there. And this is where she has to go in her descent, where she has to remove a layer of clothing or jewelry as she passes through each of the 7 gates. And then eventually Ereshkigal has her killed and he hangs up her corpse like on a meat hook. And so then it is actually a non-gendered pair of beings that are sent down to rescue her. And the way they manage to rescue her is Ereshkigal is trying to give birth and she's in pain. They show empathy to her, so she rewards them with something, and they say, well, can we have the body that you have on the meat hook? And she says, yeah, you can take it. But the thing is, they're pursued by the demons of the underworld, because one of the things about it is that once you go to the underworld, you can't return. That's even true in Greek mythology. Like if a soul's going to leave the underworld, then you have to, unless you get some kind of special exception like Orpheus did, although he screwed it up, you can't, somebody has to take your place, basically. And there are other examples of this in Greek mythology, but this one in particular, when Inanna or Ishtar, when she comes back, they want to come and take, there's all different people they want to take. They want to take her handmaid, they want to take these various people. They want to take her siblings, but they can't because all of them are in mourning. They're in sackcloth and ashes. They're mourning her death. But then when they get to her lover Tammuz, he's dressed very royally. So in other words, he's not mourning her loss. And in her rage, she goes, you can have him. So he gets dragged down to the underworld to take her place. He tries to escape and he's turned into a serpent, but they catch the serpent and they bring it to the underworld, which is also rather interesting because, again, the serpent imagery there. Serpent as kind of being this manifestation of the life force, which Tammuz is. He's ends up being a representation of that kind of regenerative force in nature. So he's taken to the underworld, and then his sister intervenes, and so they ended up making it so that she spends 6 months in the underworld, and then he comes back. So this becomes like their Persephone myth, their Demeter and Persephone myth. Persephone in the Greek spends 6 months of the year, or however many years, how many months, down with Hades in the underworld, who is now her husband. And then she spends 6 months of the year up in the upper world with her mother, and that this is the kind of the idea of the seasons, the coming and going of spring. And there's different versions of that, obviously. But we see that fertility connection there, that Chtonic connection to these lovers, to the idea of love. And I'm sure many of you who listen to this can point out many other examples from mythology. Now, Freya, I mentioned her as well. She's an interesting example because it's not that she has any particular stories that are like this one, but she is part of a group called the Vanir. They are a group of sorceresses. Like, she is seen to be the kind of embodiment of the vulva, who is the seeress. She's a magical woman who knows how to practice magic, and in particular, she is like a prophetess. Okay, she's got this kind of shamanic role. And Freya is an embodiment of that because she comes from the Vanir. She's sent as there's a war between the Aesir and the Vanir, and they exchange captives, I guess. And so she ends up being sent over to the Aesir, and she ends up becoming sort of a member of that because she marries Odin. But she is often, the stories about her portray her as somebody who is like I think that the phrase that was used was like a party girl. She's out. She's definitely out enjoying herself. I mean, yes, Odin is her husband, but there's also, tales of her, the way she acquires Brisingamen, the beautiful necklace that she has. She sees the dwarves making this necklace, and she wants it, and she wants to give them all kinds of money, and they're like, well, no, we don't need any money, but you have to have sex with each one of us, and then we'll give it to you. And so she was like, okay. So she did it, because she apparently is really taken in by jewelry and beautiful things. Then there's the whole story of how Odin finds out about how she's acquired this necklace. So he sends Loki. Loki disguises himself, shapeshifts to manage to steal the necklace from her and give it to Odin. And then she confronts Odin, and then of course Odin says, well, I know how you got that necklace. So there's this whole thing that goes on there. And then of course there's an episode where Loki, they're at a gathering, and she basically scolds Loki for something, and he turns around and says, well, you've slept with everyone, including your own brother, which she denies. But it starts to get into this little catfight battle. People are telling Loki, well, you're perverted, and there's like this whole thing that goes on in the I think it's in the Prose Edda. So Freya has this association with love and sex, and certainly of this enjoyment. So you've got this sort of tension between her having this husband who's frequently absent too. So you also see Freya as the one who is grieving for her lost husband and looking for him. But kind of similar to what we, in a way, sort of similar but different to the whole idea of Isis searching for Osiris in Egyptian mythology. Bereft wife searching for the lost spouse. But she's also on the battlefield. When battle, she is the one who is the head of the Valkyries, who I've also done a podcast on. But they come out, and so when in the battle, when the warriors are slain, there's part of them that go with her with the Valkyries to their land, and then there's part that go with Odin. All of them are being assembled as spirits for when Ragnarok occurs, which will be the end of the world and the end of, the end of existence. And when that battle takes place, these are the warriors who are going to be there for that great battle. So Freya takes some of them, and Odin takes some of the others. But very interesting to see these examples. I mean, again, we looked at Rati, who's more of a goddess of desire, not a goddess of war, but carries a sword. Okay, she still carries a weapon. And then we're seeing these other goddesses, because Ishtar Inanna is also a goddess associated with war. And as I mentioned, she is, in the book, she has this very deadly association. And this is what Gilgamesh expresses. The fact that I'm going to get involved with you, and look how all your other lovers ended. I mean, this wasn't good. It didn't end well. So he calls her out on this, and, she's deeply offended by this, and, sends the bull of heaven to kill him. But again, his friend ends up killing the bull of heaven, so spared in that way. But then his friend and his best friend Enkidu ends up losing his life for slaying the bull of heaven. He ends up being sent to the underworld, and so then there's this whole discussion about Gilgamesh trying to go to the underworld to retrieve his friend. But it's interesting here the way that we see these love goddesses who are clearly associated with the pleasure of love. And in fact, if we go back to Pygmalion and Galatea, they have a child who is called, basically is equivalent of Voluptua, like the one who has to do with pleasure. Their daughter is called Pleasure. So yeah, there's this strong connection here to pleasure and to desire. But then there's that spectrum there of whether or not you are viewing the person you are with as a subject or as an object. And so where does that fit in? And I think this is where philosophy gets involved, where the mind starts to get involved, right? It's not simply the erotic impulse, it's also where the mind gets involved. Now, our own ideas about this in modern culture are definitely connected to the ideals that we see, what we'll call, again, Abrahamic ideals. Whether you're talking about the Bible, whether you're talking about the Quran, you are talking about the ideas about love and what kind of love is acceptable, I guess. So we're often taught, and when we look at the dark feminine, okay, which relates to those aspects of the feminine that really people may find threatening. So not the creative aspects, but the destructive ones. Not the ones who are about, when we think of the Virgin Mary model, as I like to call it, not about submission, but about retaining their own sovereignty. Not about necessarily needing a man, or, in this case, but rather maintaining independence. Not being somebody who is, innocent and not knowing and relying on her husband to be the bigger person who knows everything, but rather she retains her own wisdom and has her own power. Like, her power does not come through her partner. And so these are the threatening aspects. So that's why a lot of times you will see Durga, actually, when she is confronted by the emissaries of the Mahisasura, referred to often as the great ego king in that particular epic, and he comes to tell him how wonderful, tells her, "Oh, my master is so wonderful, he's this and that." And she says, "Yeah, well, I'm sure he is, but I have this thing. He can't possibly have me unless he defeats me in battle." So there you go. There's the dark feminine. You can't have me unless you defeat me in battle, right? And I don't want to really say that that's literally the case, but dealing with this darker aspect of things, this war aspect of love, this idea where love becomes about conflict, it becomes about suffering. And with the Eros and Psyche myth, we look at this from Psyche's point of view in particular, but then in the masculine point of view, we look at this as almost a kind of war, like almost an impulse that has to be conquered in order to get to. It's either seen as conquering to get a great kind of a prize, or it's seen as, whatever it is, whether it's a battle, whether it's a physical battle, whether it's a battle of wits, whether it's a battle of, whatever it is, there's definitely this sense of, or whether it's a battle against that impulse, okay? As we saw with Gilgamesh, as we've also seen in some cases with Aphrodite, when those who either attack her or who reject her, Hippolytus being a good example. He is the one, he's more devoted to Artemis, who is a huntress, and she's also a virgin. And he basically scorns Aphrodite and anybody who would fall in love. Like, that's just, he has nothing but insults. Aphrodite gets very offended. So the way that Aphrodite gets back at him is she makes his stepmother, Phaedra, fall in love with him. And so she tries to approach him to have sex with her, and he, of course, is revolted. He's no. And so she goes to Theseus, his father, King Theseus, and says, he tried to assault me. I'm not using the R word just because that seems to get you kind of taken off in certain places. So Theseus, believing his wife, has Hippolytus dragged to his death. Okay, then later on he finds out she lied, but it's too late. And Artemis, and I always point this out as an example of the non-personal relationship of the ancient gods. Because Artemis, even though she loved Hippolytus as her devotee, and she was very, very sad about what happened, she says, well, he did insult Aphrodite. Like, it's still not, it's just kind of like, well, that's the consequences of doing that. The Trojan War heroes on the Achaean side, like Diomedes, for instance, or Idomeneus, Diomedes in particular, because he's the one who wounds Aphrodite on the battlefield. When she tries to come in to save her son Aeneas, he wounds her and says, get off the battlefield, woman. And so when he goes back to his kingdom, his wife is picked up with somebody else and he's out. So that's how Aphrodite gets back. It's just kind of like, oh, okay. Then the one who loved you is now going to love somebody else. Or you're going to be put in a love situation that's really bad. Like what we also see in the Adonis myth when Myrrha falls in love with her own father. And she contrives with her nursemaid to disguise herself so that she can have sex with her father. And then when that father finds out, of course, he's going to kill her, but she's pregnant at this point, and she's turned into a myrrh tree. And the child she gives birth to out the trunk of the tree is Adonis. And Adonis has a role quite similar to Tammuz in that he becomes this sort of almost agricultural kind of a deity. But yeah, messing with, a lot of these things that have to do with rejecting the goddess of love can lead to very, very dire consequences. Okay, just like any of the gods, but that's her particular thing, is either she brings about infidelity or she brings about situations of false accusation in a sexual matter. Yeah, and so, and these can lead to, to these very, very horrific consequences. So Aphrodite, even though she is not often associated with war, we see her on the battlefield in the Iliad, right? We see her as really being the instigator of the war because she tells Paris, oh yeah, you can have his wife. Even though it's going to bring an army on you, yeah, you can have his wife. And so he does, because Paris is a lover really and not so much of a warrior, as you will see. When although I think Paris is the one in the end who actually does get Achilles. But it's interesting to look at the dynamics there that are connected to love, and particularly to the interplay that happens between lovers, between people who are attracted to each other, and all of the kinds of things that can go along with it. Because if you've been in love, and I have asked students this question whenever I've taught love mythology, I'm like, okay, because a lot of these guys are like, what, they're 18 to 22. You assume everybody's fallen in love at least once, but there's many who go, no, I don't think I really have. And I'm like, well, okay, that's interesting. But see, a lot of them are also looking at a definition of love as being something more serious, that higher level of commitment, something that's more serious, more traditional. And that's not necessarily what I'm talking about when I mention that. I say, no, that flush of falling in love, it's something you can't really hold on to. So it does have that capricious energy that you see with a lot of these goddesses, where they seem very fickle. They're seductive one minute, and then they may turn on you in the next. Jung would call that the drama of the anima. That I think the phrase he was that the anima injects her poison, when somebody falls in love, and he has said that person's caught. When you fall in love, he said, one of the interviews he did, he said, yeah, I said, I got a client, I have a patient come to me and, he's in love with the woman and he knows, I think the phrase he used was hell of a business. She's a hell of a business. And I said, the doctor, help me, for God's sake, help me to get rid of this woman. And he says, you can't. She's caught. He says, that's the anima. That's the power of the anima. So in a way, this is almost about conquest, conquering, and being conquered. That's the terms in which a lot of this is seen. And why love, as beautiful and magical and mystical it is, this is why people also shy away from it, because, where there's love is when the absence of the lover, when one suffers over the absence. If you've been madly in love with somebody and been with that person goes away. Especially when you're talking about young love, like new love. You may feel like you just can't go on if you're not in the presence of that person. Then if you actually marry that person, then you're going to kind of go like, hey, you've got something else to do, right? But, I mean, seriously, it's that initial flush that we call love or falling in love is not the basis of a long-term relationship. I mean, it can be, as Jung has said also, he said, that may be the starting point for the relationship. And that's what he said. He said, oftentimes, this is almost a prerequisite. Yeah, this is what happens. And then, as you get to know each other, as you start to see not only the idealized versions of that person, but also what's flawed about them, and you still feel this love anyway. You still want to be with this person. Because it's about more than that kind of attraction, if that's the kind of relationship you're talking about. But my problem that I often have, and at least coming from my perspective and in dealing with the dark feminine, is that we take that other aspect, that lust, that carnal aspect, and we demonize it. We say, well, that's bad. That's why you have all these figures like these Lilith figures or these succubus figures, archetype of the succubus almost, that you see and that I've talked about in many other podcasts. But the succubus becomes like this one, like vampiric energy that's going to drain you of your soul. And it's like, no, that is your soul. That it's not draining you of your life. It is. It's but it's like Hillman says, there's this idea of pneuma or spirit being privileged over anima or soul. Because the soul definitely is more connected to nature and more connected to earthly desire. It's more chthonic. And we have decided in our moralistic system of splitting things that this kind of a desire is not good. It's something you want to avoid and stay away from. And if you engage in it, you are a quote-unquote bad girl or a bad boy, right? And honestly, I mean, again, everybody, it depends on what they want out of life and what they're interested in. My big issue has always been that we treat carnal desire like it is just something, like something filthy. And as a result, sexual desire of any type, even in the context that people kind of deem quote-unquote acceptable. Yeah, and the idea of sex for reproduction, I mean, a lot of people don't have sex for reproduction. Even married people don't necessarily have sex for reproduction. It's not, that's a very outdated concept. And again, some people want to have families, some people don't. It's not one of those things. But we treat any kind of sex outside of that kind of functional thing, at least in very strict religious terms or moral terms, like there's something sketchy or dodgy about it. And yeah, sure, things can happen. You can have unwanted pregnancies. People can pick up sexually transmitted diseases. Not that kind of stuff can't happen, but it's the problem is that we go from a very young age, especially with a strong emphasis on the virgin, because basically if you're not a virgin, then you must be a whore. It's like there's no middle ground with that axis, especially at that age. Then what we do is we teach everybody that carnality is just bad. We enjoy carnality, but it's bad. This is a goddess of love. And yeah, I mean, it's not to say that love is a very, very complex thing. And to simply separate it out to say, oh, well, there's this kind of love and this kind of love, only this kind of love is acceptable. And again, when it comes to love, it has to have two sides. So if one person feels that way and the other one doesn't, that's a whole other subject. But we have this impression from the time that we are old enough to feel that kind of desire because we hit puberty and all the hormones start to come into play and it's the tsunami that hits you. We are taught that somehow, I guess in order to stem that tide so people don't make decisions they regret, and of course that's why we have laws around that, they're taught that sex is bad. And so when you are a grown-up and old enough to have sex and make your own decisions about sex, now all of a sudden it's okay. But actually, no, it's still not, because there's still context and there's still all of this other drama that surrounds it. So really being in love is almost like being in a war, in a way. But so is most of life. We're constantly negotiating. It's not like we just get up every day and everything just goes exactly the way we want it to all the time. We're kind of pushing against forces. If you're interacting with people, there's going to be some that are fine and some maybe that are not fine. That's why I think a lot of people try to put themselves in the little bubbles to protect themselves, metaphorically speaking, but that's just the whole thing. If you're going to relate and connect to the world, you have to have a better definition of love. You have to have this idea of being able to connect with people. Because as I'm saying, there's other types of love. We're talking about carnal love, which is what these goddesses represent. But I think the problem with carnal love represents our disconnect from nature. And I think our problem with love on a broader scale, like the fact that people don't get married anymore and don't do certain things because of all the issues around it, all the toxic issues that we have between men and women that we see, I think a lot of these come out of this is where we have that intellectual disconnect. And where we don't want to engage. We don't want to sort of fight that battle, so to speak. We don't want to engage in rati-yuddha, which is this idea of the battle of desire. We treat that as something that we have to somehow exorcise or get rid of or overcome. And I understand that, yes, we see this even in Eastern religion contexts of being able to control desire. But we've done that at the expense of disconnecting from nature and from other people more generally. Because like I said, there's other kinds of love. You can have love for people that's not carnal, obviously, but we seem to be kind of short on that as well. I mean, we're moving into a society that's more tribal and where it's more like I only accept my own. So yeah, so love is a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing. It means different things to different people. You kind of need to know where you're coming from on it. But I feel like that carnality that we see represented in the love goddesses and that warlike aspect is the way in which it can create that internal war. But that dynamic, that struggle, that's really kind of an embodiment of what life itself is. Life itself is a struggle. And it's both I think I think I've said this recently again, like as Joseph Campbell says, it's an opera, but it hurts, right? It's like that we're all participating in. You can't, and I think I'd mentioned this in one of my other Instagram live streams, is that you don't get through life without wounding of some kind. So I suppose that's where the phrase comes from. It's better to have loved and lost than not to have loved at all, right? But interestingly, I think I want to leave on this last note because I feel like I'm going on for a very long time on this subject. One of the things Campbell had said, and he does a section on love and his power of myth, and he talks about the different levels of love. So the love of a parent for their child, the love of a wife for her husband and vice versa, the love of a nun for Christ, as he said, spiritual kind of love, right? That's this chaste kind of love. And he goes through these things and he says, what the highest kind of love is. And Bill Moyers is like, no, and he says it's the love, it's the love of the prostitute, because this is somebody who's willing to engage in love in spite of reputation. Not only are they willing to give up whatever maybe they have, so they're giving up what they have socially, they may be giving up certain things because there's a desire there that is stronger than reputation. And that's the one I think that's considered to be more dangerous. Now, that does not mean that women who don't get married and so forth are prostitutes, But when when it's spoken about in these kinds of terms, it's considered to be a negative. The sexually independent female is considered to be a negative. But sometimes, it doesn't just have to be women who are single. Women who are married can experience this as well. I mean, the idea that you're going to get married and now you're going to sit there and be, this just subservient and bowing to your husband all the time. I mean, I'm not even sure. I don't know. I guess there are men out there who like that, but some men would get very, very bored with that. I don't want somebody who's just and honestly, I don't think that's the way the dynamic should be. But we're not really raised to learn what the proper dynamic should be. We're raised to all believe that sex is scary and we should stay away from it, but it's something everybody wants. So then it becomes this kind of dirty, forbidden thing, which means that way when people get married, mom, your wife becomes sort of like the mom archetype. And now, if you're going to do the sex thing, it's got to be with somebody else. Maybe even the ancient Greeks thought that. Maybe that's why Hera is too proper to always have sex with her husband. And she only seemed to have sex with him when she was trying to trick him into something. So that's why he's out with all these other women, because his wife is too special for that carnal desire, right? So yeah, you have to think about all these factors. I could talk about this for much longer, but I'm going to stop now and say thank you so much for listening. I want to thank my patrons again. I thanked them at the beginning of my episode. More and more people are joining Patreon. I'm really grateful. So I'll be getting to a point where my initial YouTube graphic is not going to be enough. Maybe even the reading of names is not going to be enough. So we'll see how that eventually goes. But if you are interested in joining my Patreon and you haven't, it's patreon.com/Chthonia. My general website, which does need a little updating, but most of everything is there, including the initial concept for this podcast. Links to all my publications and so forth is on chthonia.net. And my social media is Chthonia Podcast, one word on Instagram and X, 2 words on Facebook, and it's usually just Chthonia on YouTube, although I think you can now find it in our Chthonia Podcast as well as one word. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.